Hi, everyone, and welcome back to a new episode of the Sustainable Cannabis Coalition podcast, in which we talk all things sustainability with some of the most distinguished experts in the cannabis industry. I'm your host, Rodrigo Pereira, VP of Product Management at GrowIQ. Today, I'll be talking with a team at Byers, Mark Byers, CEO and founder, and Will Bisuete, Chief Scientific Officer for Byers Emission Analysis. We'll be joined by Tristan Strauss, CEO of Headwaters and President of CARP. Mark, Will, and Tristan will discuss air quality, odor mitigation, and emission analysis in indoor cultivation, and how these factors come into play when thinking about sustainability of cannabis cultivation within communities. It's a great episode. Stay tuned to listen. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Sustainable Cannabis Coalition podcast. Today, we have a great panel for us. Joining from Byers Scientific, we have Mark Byers, founder and president and CEO of Byers Scientific. We also have Dr. Will Bisuete, Chief Scientific Officer for Byers Emissions and Analysis, and Tristan Strauss, CEO of Headwaters and president of CARP Growers. Gentlemen, thank you. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, we always, for those listeners that might not be familiar with Byers and Headwaters and CARP, we always want to give them a little bit of background. I think not only the companies, but as you as people. So, Mark, I'll start with you. Just if you could give us a little bit of background on yourself, on Byers, and then how you entered the cannabis industry.
Sure. Thank you, Rodrigo, and it's a pleasure to meet you. I've had a pretty crazy background. I grew up in Oregon, and I went from racing sled dogs to breaking horses to serving in the military to finally realizing I should probably go to college. And then I took a stop in Russia for 5 years. When I finally grew up and finished school and finished my master's degree in finance, I was in the banking industry and as an investment advisor. And I finally got away from that and started doing some consulting for a project in Idaho that was exploring industrial scale composting. That kind of got me into this part of the business that I'm in as I started to examine that industry and understood there were a lot of missing parts. And so we created this odor control business. We were rolling along in the solid waste space. And then I got a call from a gentleman in Carpinteria, California, asking if I could deal with cannabis odor. And I said we could. We knew that we had a formulation specifically for cannabis. And we came out here, did a pilot. The pilot did extremely well. And it took off from there, and building on that, we've grown to really effectively probably be the largest in this space in North America. We work with some of the largest cultivators in North America, like Canopy Growth and True Leave and others. But we do a tremendous amount of work right here in Carpinteria because I think the public doesn't appreciate necessarily by virtue of not understanding or not having this insight that it's actually one of the largest concentrations of cannabis cultivation in North America. And it's just a tremendous place to be and has really been the platform upon which we've built the business.
Mark, thank you. And I'm intrigued by your background. That's really fascinating. That's really, really fascinating.
Yeah, thank you.
Will, I'll pass it over to you.
So I'm a associate professor at the Gillen School of Public Health in the Department of Environmental Science and Engineering. I've been there for the last 15 years, actually. And in my research, I study air pollution, air quality, and climate, and its connections with public health. And through that research, I run a lot of air quality models that simulate how air pollution is formed, say, over the city of Houston or Denver or all over the planet. And a really key component of that air quality model is the emissions that come from plants all over the planet. And so I've been in that community and have collaborators in that community And one summer we were at a conference in Denver with a colleague of mine. She's at the was at the time the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and we were talking about the legalized cannabis industry in Denver, and the fact that it's mostly indoors, it's mostly in warehouse spaces, and it's mostly concentrated in downtown Denver, which is on the has air quality issues. Mm-hmm. And so we over a beer we thought, well, could it be possible that emissions from plants could have an impact on air quality? And then, that led to some funding and a few publications, I think, which caught the attention of buyers. And so what's interesting about this space is that this is an industry that has no federal support for research. Things like EPA, NOAA, NSF, OSHA are providing very little scientific data to allow folks to make decisions. And so in the absence of that, that's why I decided to start my research there. But with no grant dollars, the only way to really continue those efforts was through private efforts, which is what brought me to buyers.
Interesting. And Will, so it's really interesting being someone that grew up in Mexico City. I think the issue of air pollution and air quality is certainly something that resonates with me.
Well, myself as well. So my family, my father was from Ecuador and my mother was born in Guatemala. And yeah, I distinctly remember being in Guatemala City and in Quito at times where, the air pollution is, eyes burning, throat burning, all of your clothes. It's 68 million people worldwide die from exposure to air pollution. And 90% of those deaths are in low and middle income countries. So that's what motivates my research.
That's awesome. That's fascinating. Tristan, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, my name's Tristan Strauss. I'm the CEO and founder of Headwaters and the current president of Carp Growers. I grew up in a small town in Southern California, Ojai, California, and my dad had a large citrus orchard, and every time I got in trouble, I would have to go fix irrigations in certain blocks. And turns out I got in trouble a lot. So I spent a lot of time in the orange orchard as a kid. And that kind of just spurred an interest in agriculture for me. So I studied at the University of Santa Cruz, sustainable agriculture. And I graduated in 2008 and started a small organic berry and veggie farm. And turns out that in 2008, it was pretty rough to get into the organic food market given the current economic crisis. But this other plant and this other market in this medical component of California started to really grow and flourish. So I quickly transitioned and switched crops and got involved in the medical market of cannabis and watched the industry change and evolve and mature over time. And in 2018, we really focused our business as one of the leaders in cultivation and distribution in the California cannabis market. Today, we have cultivation operations in Northern California, Central California, Southern California. We're one of the largest distributors of bulk cannabis in California today. We've created an amazing team, and we're really excited at the potential of what's in front of us here today.
Man, Tristan, that's fantastic background, and I'm sure your hours of working and fixing irrigation lines in the orange groves are paying dividends now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I still when I go home, my dad still puts me in the orange orchard, so maybe I'm not quite accomplished enough.
Fantastic. All right, so let's go right to the conversation, and Will, I'll start with you. So since we're talking sustainability, sustainability is all about being not only a steward of the environment, but also thinking about societal impacts of, in your particular case, of air quality and odor emissions. Do you tell me about, I guess, some of the cannabis industry's potential contribution to these environmental and social areas of concern, and how do emissions like BVOCs, and maybe you can tell our listeners what a BVOC is, how do they have an impact on air quality and I guess in the community, like you mentioned in Denver?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about plants for a second before we get into its potential impacts. So plants are living things just like you and I, and they breathe in and out just like you and I. And just like you and I, depending on what we ate or what our genetic background is, the chemicals that are coming out of our breath can be quite different. And think about how they test for alcohol, right? They have you do a breathalyzer test, right? So they're measuring chemicals in the air. Well, just like us, plants also breathe things in and out, and they breathe out actually a large number of compounds. At Bayer's emissions, we measure over 200 of these different kinds of what we call volatile compounds. And so, and they contain hydrogen, carbon, sulfur, oxygen, nitrogen, you name it. There's a whole host of different kinds of molecules that are emitted by these plants. And so we should understand how they're emitted is, sometimes they're actually gases that come out of the leaves themselves. Sometimes there's pools of chemicals that are evaporating off the plant material itself. And so this is slightly different than measuring the amount of material that's, say, in a plant tissue, which is often done to assess quality of plants. This is something a little different. And it sometimes is and sometimes isn't correlated with the amount that's in a tissue. So these are actually what these plants are breathing out. And so what are they breathing out? So one of the things that you mentioned was BVOC. So VOC is a volatile organic compound. And the B part of the volatile organic compound is the biogenic volatile organic compound. So what we mean by a volatile organic compound is just something that's volatile or likes to be in the gas phase. You can think of things like that pine smell that you smell in a forest. That's actually a gas that's being emitted by those pine trees that you're breathing in. That's a volatile organic compound. And since it came from a plant, we say it's a biogenic volatile organic compound, as opposed to, say, gasoline evaporation, which is like benzene or toluene, which is also a volatile organic compound, but it's a man-made one or an anthropogenic one, right? And so volatile organic compounds are just one kind of compound that is produced by plants that are emitted, but they also produce sulfur compounds and also other nitrogen compounds. And so it should be important to note that these BVOCs or biogenic volatile organic compounds are not toxic in themselves, right? So they're actually, naturally occurring species that we breathe in all the time. That pine smell, for example, or that lime smell. Those are all volatile organic compounds. And of the hundreds of species that we've measured from the cannabis species, what we found is they're very common to other biogenic volatile organic compounds. So there's nothing unique in the volatile organic compounds that are being produced by these plants, and they're completely non-toxic. Now, the issue that we have with them is these volatile organic compounds can participate in reactions in the atmosphere that produce ozone and particulate matter, and that's the concern. One of the concerns we have for its impact on air quality. Now, both ozone and particulate matter are made through reactions in the atmosphere that require an energy source like sunlight and also sources of combustion like vehicles and cars. And in that mixture in the atmosphere, they produce ozone and they produce particulate matter, which are known to be harmful to human health. So it really depends on the conditions of the atmosphere that determine whether the ozone's produced or the particulate matter's produced. In a lot of cases, the biogenic volatile organic compounds that are emitted into the atmosphere actually have no impact whatsoever on ozone because the conditions aren't right to cook up and make that ozone or to cook up and make that particulate matter.
Well,
go ahead.
Please keep going.
Well, okay. So, and just to finish up there, so you asked about, its impact on Denver. So let's look at as a case study, biogenic VOCs that come from the cannabis industry in, say, the city of Denver, and biogenic volatile organic compounds in the Carpinteria area, both of which I've modeled. both of which I've developed and calculated the emissions for. And what we see is virtually no impact on ozone in Carpinteria and a much higher impact in Denver. And the reason for that is that in Carpinteria, there's already a whole bunch of biogenic volatile organic compounds from a whole host of other sources that are actually much larger in magnitude than the addition by the cannabis industry in the county that Carpinteria is in. In Denver, however, it's high desert, and there's actually very little biogenic volatile organic compounds. So the contribution is much higher from the industry, and thus has the opportunity to make produce more ozone. And so it's really dependent on the environment that you're in, whether there's an air quality impact from these emissions.
So, Will, I think this is fascinating, just in terms of, this is kind of a primer into the field. So, I think the next thing that would kind of jump out at me is, how do you go about measuring this, or like you said, modeling it? I guess, what are some of the methods or tools that you use to quantify emissions and the potential impact?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, before we didn't even know there was an issue, right? So I was telling you about earlier that I was having a beer with my colleague and we were talking about this. And, at that point it was just speculation. And if this was any other industry, what I would do is I would go and look up, say, an emission factor. Like I could look up, if you tell me what kind of car you had, how fast you were going, and how many miles you traveled, I could go and look up from the EPA how much pollution you put into the air. I could then take that and run an air quality model and tell you how much ozone you contributed to your neighbor or to the city. Those tools exist, and they have to, because we have Clean Air Act and we have regulatory standards to do those things. Marijuana, cannabis, is a federally illicit substance. So I went and looked up the EPA emission factor for cannabis. It doesn't exist. And so I can't do the same thing I would for your car, I couldn't do for the industry. And so what was missing is that emission factor. Fundamentally, like, what is our understanding of what sort of emissions are coming from plants? Now, luckily, we've been studying plant emissions for the last 40 years. Alex Gunther, who's our senior scientist in the company, is a leader in this field. And the field and the community has developed really robust ways of measuring and understanding what's the rate of those. And so basically what I did was apply those techniques, and that's what we do at Bioscientific, is apply those techniques so that we can get a full fingerprint, if you will, profile of every single gas molecule that's coming out of that plant. And so that didn't exist at the time. And when I did that, and some subsequent work that we've been doing at Byers, is that we found that there's a large variability in not only the kind of molecule, but the rate that it comes. And it varies not only by life cycle, as in the juvenile versus maturing, but there's also a huge variety in gas phase emissions between strains. And in the state of Colorado, we know there's 600 plus different strains. We've expanded our database to have a number of those strains. And what we see quite clearly is a large variability in the kind of molecules and the amount of molecules by strain. Which means that site-specific kind of analysis has to be needed. So that's just one part. So at getting the emissions, we're using existing tools and methods to get those emissions. And so once you know that, then you can tell me the number of plants you have, how many are mature, how many are juvenile. And we also measure the air in places where we process, dry, and cure those. So we have a total emission inventory from seed all the way through until it leaves the facility, after whether it's cured or processed. And as it turns out, some of the highest emissions of the process actually are in the processing part of that cultivation cycle, right? So we have the ability to do these leaf enclosures to do a strain. We also do ambient measurements, so we can get kind of a top-down inventory. And then you add that all together, and then you need to know, well, how does that impact downwind? And so we use site-specific meteorology and EPA-approved regulatory air quality models to predict those. We also use dispersion models like AirMod, which is used by the community for permitting. And so, these tools exist, right? What is missing is fundamental knowledge of the emissions of those plants, right? And that's where Byers emissions comes in. Our ability to not only rely on our existing database, but our ability to go out and measure in the field or on the site to get actual site-specific emissions. Because it appears to be, and the more that we're looking into it, there's so much variability among strains that there is no one emission factor fits all, unfortunately, at least so far that we've been able to see to do this. And I'll just say lastly, not just for air quality, but also for odor, we seem to be on the trail that suspicion that molecules that are actually emitted by the plant themselves are contributing to odor. And so both the air quality and the odor issue, I think, boil down to having an understanding of what molecules are leaving both the plant and your facility, and then using that fundamental knowledge and relying on existing regulatory tools to assess impacts on odor and air quality.
Well, so this is, I think my takeaway, all this is, I think what I find really fascinating is you're sort of at that stage where you're, with known methods, from the measurement side of things and modeling side of things, you're really building this from the bottoms up, basically, in the context of the cannabis industry. And it just also strikes me that I think a lot of what you're doing could be used to then influence maybe regulatory standards in the future.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I mean, that's kind of why I got into this from the first place. If I go back to my original intent, right? There are folks who are making decisions about this industry, and right now, for the most part, they're making decisions in the absence of real scientific data, and that leads to ineffective decisions, right? I mean, nobody wants to make decisions in that area of uncertainty, and so I see a clear path of how we can provide decision makers and stakeholders with the data they need to make the decisions that everyone can be happy with or not happy with, but at least an informed decision, right? And also not only an effective policy, but also in control mitigation, right? Right now, before, if you don't have a buyer's emission analysis of your facility, you have no idea how much molecules are being put into your facility, and therefore you can't possibly be able to optimally engineer the amount to capture just that right amount. And so we're talking about sustainability on this podcast. Let's talk about energy usage, right? Let's talk about all that demand, right? So if you have an unoptimized control mitigation system, you may be wasting energy, or on the other hand, underperforming and leading to these issues that we've been talking about.
And Will, I think that's a perfect segue to my next question to Mark. Mark, from the buyer's perspective, how is it that your approach going through that assessment that Will just mentioned in terms of cultivation facility and processing sites, how does that result in more environmentally and socially sustainable operations?
Right. Well, and yeah, you nailed it with what Will said, that the natural segue is, well, then how do we leverage all this information that we've gathered to ultimately solve the main focus of our business, which is the odor mitigation. Everything we do, long before we got into the cannabis business, was really based on efficiency, right? Using the least amount of energy input to still get the greatest gain. And so when we know, as Will described, when we know what is basically being emitted, what's being exhaled, then, and we're able to extrapolate that across an entire canopy, then we're able to more precisely sort of tailor what the proper mitigation solution is. So if we're using a combination of molecular scrubbing or molecular filtration, which is commonly called carbon scrubbing, but we kind of like to avoid that term. A more accurate description is molecular filtration. A combination of that in our vapor phase, which means we're not using water. We're really refining the precise amount that is necessary to get the job done without taxing the electrical system or the grid more than necessary. But also, not putting more carbon that needs to be used, because eventually that carbon needs to be replaced and that has to go somewhere. Hopefully we're using a little less of the vapor product because we don't bring a drop of water into any market where we work with the vapor product. that said, that water does come from somewhere,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
So if it originates where our product is created, then, I guess you could even argue by extension, sustainability in our approach here has a kind of a trickle down effect to sustainability in other environments where all this stuff is created. So yeah, really, ultimately, those emission rates and what we find from that feeds into the most efficient solution in terms of, one, getting the job done, which means, sustainability, as we said early on, is also a function of just imposing externalities on the community, right? And that would be odor. And if we're able to reduce that or significantly mitigate, well, that's a big one right there. But even more so, the lowering the use of energy and water across the entire profile is probably the biggest takeaway from doing the emission rates assessment.
Fantastic. And Tristan, I think I'd love to bring you into the conversation now. And obviously you're doing this on a day-to-day business or day-to-day on a day-to-day, and it's your business. So as we talk sustainability, I think what are some of those recommendations for large-scale cannabis cultivation to be more environmentally and socially sustainable?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's a really critical component and of our business at Headwaters, and also on the carp growers level. It's integrated into our mission statement at the association, and I really feel passionate about what this plant and what cannabis can potentially do for agriculture, commercial agriculture, and organic. But I think what's really interesting is the timing in history in which cannabis is being legalized. The technology available today is nothing like it was in the 80s in terms of agricultural practices, in terms of tracking, in terms of the detailed physics and chemistry that we're able to look at. I mean, the work that Will and Mark are doing at Byers is incredible. How detailed we can get, and the reason why I'm bringing that up is I think that the profitability of cannabis today really can push agriculture into a place that in, let's say, the tomato and strawberry market, we just don't have those kinds of incentives and that kind of possible R&D pool. So I think my advice to other large-scale commercial growers is, first and foremost, in California, you have to understand the regulations. So all the different municipalities have different regulations, and within those regulations, operators will find how to interact with their community, what is potentially possible, what isn't. And I think that large-scale cannabis, there has a lot of stigmas against it in California today. I mean, if we look at Carpinteria as a lens to look at the potentials of the impacts on the community, I mean, it's significant in Carpinteria, and we all know that odor's at the top of the list. But before odor, it was traffic, it was crime, it was real estate, prices plummeting. And I think through the work that carp growers did and does on a regular basis, on a daily basis, to take the narrative and create a positive dynamic is critical. And I think a lot of us, when we think the word sustainability, we're driven and targeted to think about an environmental approach. But I think there's also a really large community and social component of sustainability. And that's critical as cannabis becomes more integrated and more normalized for large-scale operations, that operators need to focus on how are they impacting the community? Are they integrated into the community? What they can do to further integrate their operations to become critical members of a sustainable community into the future.
Tristan, and yeah, I think what strikes me from what you just said is it's really, you're almost taking a holistic approach to all of this, which is, on the one hand, there's a technology to sustain this, but cultivators also have to think about, not only their inputs used, but also the effect on the society, on community, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. I think internally within an organization, you have to be very conscious about what you're using. So what materials are you using? Can you reduce the use of those materials? Can you reuse materials? Can you recycle materials? Because really farming is this amazing component of the natural ecosystem where we can take inputs in the form of energy from the sun, add fertilizer, add an incredible genetic pool that these plants create, and then produce a product that's consumed within California. And so that's a really exciting opportunity to look at the science and data in ways that we can reduce and reuse materials. And the incentive is it also reduces costs. So you create a more profitable organization. There's a longer, more sustainable projection for your business to be continually growing and integrated in terms of your operations. But I think I just want to also touch on the carp growers level. Carp growers is really, I think, an incredible association. I've been in agriculture for a long time, and I've never seen the level of camaraderie and participation that exists there. So Carp Growers is essentially 13 different cannabis businesses representing 20 farms in Carpinteria. We all decided to join together for a common goal, which is really to give back to the local community. And we wanted to build a sustainable relationship with the residents of Carpinteria. So what we structured it was all members of Carp Growers pay dues to the associations. And that's really based on the size of their respective farms and the amount of licenses per farm. And then within that association, we've created really strict guidelines that all members have to adhere to, strict best management practices that are focused on sustainability and environmental stewardship. So on one hand, we're very integrated into the community where all of our dues are contributing to projects that are community driven. And then on the operational side, we have best management practices that every operator and every farm has to adhere to, such as strict regulations on pesticide use. All of our water, all of our fertilized water has to be reused. So we all have recirculation systems where all of the water that comes out of the drain, let's say out of our individual pots, is collected, cleaned, and then recycled into our fertigation system. So the idea is to really create closed loop operations within the community. Mm-hmm. And I think that the target right now, which is why I think Carp Growers and Headwaters and a couple other operators are working really closely with Mark, who see some really great potential in closing the loop on the odor component.
Fantastic. And I think this also brings me to my next question. And Mark, this is for you, and which on what Tristan was talking on, really leveraging technology to help drive that sustainability. So I want to understand more, how is it that installing your units help with, in this case, air exchanges to be able to save energy and reduce waste and kind of drive out those things that Tristan was talking about?
Right. Well, we spent really a couple of years. It's hard to believe, but we were doing it sort of, behind the scenes, so to speak, of really trying to suss out whether you can actually, scrub a cultivation, because the conventional wisdom was, well, no, you don't scrub the air in the grow. You can do that in processing and in other areas, but greenhouses, they vent, and you'd be basically scrubbing the atmosphere. And we said, well, no, that's not true. Actually, there are times when the cultivation, when we discover or observe peak odor conditions, is when light depth is in place, vents are closed. You actually can scrub that air quite efficiently and sequester all those gases and thereby those odors in carbon. That's the starting hypothesis. The key, however, and this is a lot of what our research focused on this side of the house in terms of our mitigation technologies, was identifying sort of the sweet spot on the number of exchanges that are required. Well, part of that is based right back to Will and Alex's work on the gas phase emission rate. Will didn't word it this way, but when Will says that, everything, all these plants exhale, well, we can basically calculate what that rate is. And so we said, well, if we're able to exchange air at close to the same rate that they exhale, well, then it follows that we should be scooping up a lot of that before it really has a chance to accumulate. And so we were able to find sort of a sweet spot. And I say sweet spot because, you could extrapolate that and say, well, if you had 100,000 CFM and we're exchanging air every minute, clearly you would get the job done, but you would also be, sucking people into the machine, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And take it to the other end of the extreme where these, with all due respect to my other competitors in the market, but in terms of these can filters, which are sort of, proliferate through the industry, those are 1980s technology being brought to bear on a 2021 problem. They're just not up to the task. And so that's an efficiency question, an efficient use of energy. And so we were able to identify the prime substrate in terms of the carbon that is the most effective in adsorbing what we've identified as the very particular compounds associated with cannabis odor, and then using a fan size to get the proper amount of exchanges while using the least amount of energy. But then it goes further than that, to Tristan's point with respect to technology. So I think it's safe to say that you have technological advantage when you have something in the world today that can be controlled off of your phone. That almost starts to become the benchmark, it seems like. And that's what I aim to do with our technology. Early on, we developed our own SCADA system, which I wouldn't expect people to know, but SCADA it's basically, when you have computers that are running equipment and then putting that data back to a server that then you can remotely, manipulate. And that, of course, means, turn up, turn down, monitor, turn off, pull reports, any of those, 2021 kind of things. But then we raised the bar here recently by moving that to what's called IoT, or, Internet of Things, which everyone is familiar with, which is really another way of just saying cloud-based. So now our entire platform sits on a Microsoft Azure server farm. And I, basically we achieved the goal that we could now run an entire, I'll give you an example, actually the farm where I am. When we get done with this project, we'll have 30 scrubbers and 4 vapor machines, and I'll run that entire system off of my phone in New Zealand if I want, any connected device. And so, not for the sake of being able to do that, but really, of course, for the sake that when everything is that technologically connected and automated and intelligent, then we can start taking in input signals from things like, for instance, light depth is starting to crack, right, and open up. Well, then, of course, you wouldn't know this, but let's say the vapor system that runs on the outside, and that's doing its part of odor mitigation. Well, if we're in light depth and things are closed up, traditionally, right now, we still have units running 24/7, even though there might be certain times of the day that that's not the most optimal. Well, now, with this, we're able to idle those down. They're using less power. The scrubbers are doing their work. And then as conditions change, like I said, light depth starting to open up, we can idle down the scrubbers and the vapor system picks up. So, it's pretty intuitive. These are machines talking to each other and taking input signals from other external sources like the greenhouse control systems, for instance. That automation clearly saves a lot of energy, a lot of consumables, and is really working the most efficiently that it possibly can.
So I couldn't agree more, Mark. I think like Tristan said, it's not only from the cultivator side, but I think those vendors into the industry have to understand some of these interconnections to, in order to drive the efficiency and ultimately through driving efficiency and interconnectedness and intelligence, be able to drive sustainability.
Yeah. Hopefully this approach, we'd love to see this become the standard where we sort of pass off manual operations to more automation, because in reality, through the rest of I think Tristan, for instance, would probably agree, there's a bunch of things in his operations that are fairly automated at this point. The greenhouse control systems, they're monitoring, I should say, humidity and temperature levels and ridge vents and things like this, and are adjusted accordingly. There's no reason that other parts of the entire chain shouldn't be following that same model. And as we start to gather all these signals, basically, we can make it even more efficient.
Absolutely. So, gentlemen, we're about to run out of time here. Just one last question, because I think this has been such a stimulating conversation, and I think your point of views are well worth getting that last little bit. If you're looking into the future, Mark, Will, from the buyer's perspective, what do you see being some of the most important innovations, or some of the most important impact you could have? And Tristan, probably same question on your end. Where do you see sustainability within the context of cultivators going? So, Mark and Will, I'll pass that over to you first.
I'll go from the emission standpoint, and then I'll let Mark talk from the mitigation standpoint. I think from the emission standpoint, it's pretty clear that we need to get a handle on the emission factors for these plants. There's not only their strain dependence, but also their temperature dependence and their light sensitivity. We know from other plants that the amount of rates are dependent on temperatures and light. And we know very little about that dimension for this plant. And I think the other thing that is really something that is going to be a challenge is trying to understand the relationship between the strain and the profile that the gases that are produced, and how a certain strain is actually the strain it is, or it may be something else that's different from another place. And I think the last thing is trying to understand the odor issue and being able to target what molecules are most contributing to that odor issue are on the horizon, and what we are actually working on at Buyers.
Right, and following up with that, the better that we understand what the true odor emission is, and what I mean by that is that the industry grew up, so to speak, assigning blame to one particular terpene, which was just sort of some kind of interesting science. Just because it's the most prevalent terpene, everyone decided, okay, that's what gives it its odor. It's just wrong. It's 100% wrong. And it turns out to even really be less dependent on terpenes. They still, of course, play a role. But there are other elements within the plant that we now have pretty successfully identified as being the culprits. And so now our job is to better understand how to mitigate that, now that we have a better insight into what that compound is. But to Will's point, while we can continue to do the chemistry, the analytical work to understand how to defeat it, we have to continue to understand what that emission looks like, because the variability is tremendous. And, it's kind of hard to bring a sniper rifle to a fight when the target is running just left and right, back and forth, and, in terms of that variability. So that'll be the challenge for us going forward.
And Tristan, I'll pass it over in the last one.
I think in terms of sustainability, I think that more and more across industries, companies are choosing to uphold an ethical responsibility to play positive roles in their community, as well as focus on materials consumed, emissions produced, etc. So I think that However, in that lens, if we're looking at through the lens of sustainability, businesses can be vilified and get a bad rap because they are production centers, they are contributing pollutants. And so I think that as a business owner and leader in the cannabis industry, I want to challenge that notion. I think that my perspective is businesses are a tool for change. And if directed properly and ethically, businesses can really be the tool to realize the change that we want to see in the world. I think that as a business owner, I think it's important not to only think about financial gains, but equally important are our social and environmental values and how our businesses can continue to foster that mentality and that vision and perspective. I think that once that's fully realized, then we'll really see sustainable businesses with lasting futures.
Fantastic, Tristan. That's a great final thought. Mark, Will, Tristan, an absolute pleasure having you here today. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, Rodrigo, thanks for having us.
That was been
much.
Yeah,
all
thank
right,
you. It was a
thank
pleasure.
you. Another episode of the Sustainable Cannabis Coalition in the books. Signing off for now. Thank you. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Sustainable Cannabis Coalition podcast. If you like what you heard, tune into our next episode and make sure to check out our content on our website at sustainablecannabiscoalition.com and make sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Yep, we're pretty much everywhere. Till next time.